happy to have you here with us on the Stronger Marriage webinar produced by the Utah Marriage Commission, hosted by Utah State University. I'm Alexis Alcott, the UMC Interim Program Coordinator, and we're so excited to have you join us today as we celebrate 25 years of marriage celebrations in 2023. A big part of the marriage celebrations that we're doing is these webinars. And today we're so excited to be joined by Shawn Christiansen, who is a PhD and a professor of family life and human development at Southern Utah University. He has an MS from Brigham Young University in family life education, an MSW from the University of Utah, and a PhD from the University of Delaware in individual and family studies. As a licensed clinical social worker in private practice, he uses acceptance and commitment therapy, to teach clients mindfulness skills to deal with anxiety and depression, and as a foundation for marital connection. He's married to Tiffany, and they have 4 children and 3 grandchildren. The webinar today discusses how mindfulness provides the foundation for healthy intimacy, connection, and conflict resolution. Principles and practices from acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness, and meditation are presented that ground and center us as we navigate the storms that disrupt our personal life and relationships. If you have any questions throughout the entirety of the presentation, please save them. For the end section or for the last 15 minutes, we will be having a Q&A. You can ask all of your questions, the function at the bottom of your screen, which is the Q&A function. The chat will be turned off during the entirety of the presentation, so this is really the best place to ask Shawn any questions that you might have. So write down your questions and save them for the end. If you've joined us for the CEU credit today, make sure to stay on until the end of the presentation. The survey needed for your credit will automatically load onto the screen, and then you'll receive an email from the Utah Marriage Commission with your certificate. You may also email the Utah Marriage Commission to receive your survey on this webinar. That email is marriagecommission@usu.edu. Once the survey is completed, you'll obtain an email from us with your CEU credit verification. We'll now turn the time over to Shawn for his presentation.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. Just starting out, the principles that my presentation are founded on are mindfulness, but also attachment theory. That's where a lot of emotional focused therapy has been developed to look at the relationship of a couple as they try to connect, but also work through the natural rhythms of the relationship where there may be disconnection or conflict. So if you can start with the first. So as I mentioned, the beginning part of the relationship is this principle called synchrony. And with synchrony, the idea is based on some work by Ed Tronick, where he did what's called the still face experiment. And the still face experiment is basically where you just have an infant, roughly 10 months of age or so, and you have a mother or father who is interacting with that infant. And the typical dance for an infant and a parent is the baby smiles, the mom smiles, the baby smiles, the mom smiles, and they're in this synchrony or this dance with one another. They're attuned to each other's emotions. And what Ed Tronick had these parents do is, as they're in this dance, to kind of pause and look away. And then when they resumed that interaction, instead of having the smile that invites the synchrony, instead he taught them or told them to have a still face, a face with no smile, no emotion. And as the infant would stare at the parent, they're expecting the smile, this animation, this connection, and instead they just get the still face. Nothing is there. And at first, the child just kind of, sees that as a normal part of this dance. And so the infant smiles more, tries to engage more, expecting the parent to engage with a smile or a voice. And yet the parent says nothing and has no emotional expression on their face. At this point, the baby becomes upset. The baby might look away. The baby might start, crying, sucking their hand to calm themselves. And again, turn back to the parent, bidding for connection. And yet the parent again has this still face, no emotional response. And by this time, the child becomes very dysregulated. The child starts crying. because what they expect in this relationship, this attunement, this synchrony is not there, and so they become emotionally upset. So what's fascinating with this process of synchrony and this idea of attaching and attuning to one another is the same principle that happens in infancy is the same exact dance that we see in adult relationships. So in a class that I teach, I'll show a video of this synchrony of parent and child interacting together. And after I show that, I show a couple working through conflict. And it's interesting, it's the same process. When the couple's in tuned or attuned with one another, in tune with one another, they have this dance of being able to see emotion, to respond in ways that create connection, and they have this easy relationship. But when couples are out of sync, you see oftentimes with conflict, one partner might turn away. If they can't, or if they feel overwhelmed, they may turn away to calm the relationship down, or they may leave the relationship. And that becomes part of the dance, because as someone pulls away, then what is that response for the other partner? Do they pursue? Or because they feel this partner is withdrawing, they also they'll feel disconnected, do they also pull away? So often you get these response of a pursue, withdraw pattern of behavior, or pursue, withdraw, withdraw, pursue. And this becomes kind of a normal dance that many couples experience. And so in a relationship where you have emotion and passion and so forth, it's very natural to have these ups and downs. And so process of what creates healthy relationships is how do we tune back in? How do we reconnect when our dance gets off? And that's really what the basis of emotion-focused therapy is teaching couples how to work through these pushes and pulls of the relationship, how to reconnect when their dance gets off. This dance, however, this intimacy, I should say, and the connection can only be built, though, if the couple feels safety in this relationship, that they feel like they can be vulnerable, that they can be open. If they don't, they often then, with that, they don't feel safe, that's where you get the withdrawal, because they don't feel vulnerable to be able to express how they feel. Or what happens, because they want so much to connect and they don't feel like they're connecting, often that hurt is expressed as anger. So they're wanting to connect, they're wanting to be in the relationship, but as they pursue the relationship with their anger, this often pushes their partner away and they kind of get the opposite of what they expect. And so emotion-focused therapy is basically helping couples recognize when their dance is off and learning how to tune in to their own emotions and learning to tune into their partner's emotions, creating a safe environment so that they can reconnect and continue on in this synchrony. If you look at, a relationship, when I feel safe, I do this, I open up, I invite this conversation, this vulnerability. When I feel hurt or maybe misunderstood or I don't feel validated, I tend to close off and again withdraw. Or again, the other response, rather than withdrawing, is I feel hurt, but I want to connect. And so that desire for connection is expressed through anger. And again, so if you can go to the next slide. So as I said before, emotion-focused therapy is a very common evidence-based therapy for couples. It's based on the work of Sue Johnson. But often as I find working with couples in trying to establish this dance and this ability to find synchrony, is that often you have to have the skills to be able to tune into yourself, be able to recognize your thoughts and feelings, and be open and accepting to the thoughts and feelings of a partner. And so in essence, if you don't have those skills to be able to understand yourself emotionally and be able to be centered, to be grounded, to manage emotion, often what happens is then couples will escalate as they try to connect through their desire. They want love, they want connection, but as they pursue through their hurt and they pursue through their anger, the relationship often escalates and the conflict escalates, and then that often leads to withdrawal. And the danger sign is when that withdrawal just leads to stopping disengaging because it's too painful to engage. That even though they want to engage, they want to connect, that when they try to reconnect, the hurt is so great. So over time, the real red flag for the relationship is withdrawal, where you stop trying to dance or trying to engage. So a couple of questions related to, does it take two to tango? Of course. And that's part of then relationship skills of how do we learn to dance in ways that show support and creates love. So here's some questions that come from a therapy called acceptance and commitment therapy. Acceptance and commitment therapy is a mindfulness-based therapy. It primarily focuses on how to help people with anxiety and depression, but there is also an application for relationships. And all of this work in acceptance and commitment therapy, well, a lot of the work, there's a lot of different people have done it, but in terms of what I'm referring today is the work of Russ Harris. And Russ Harris has written both about acceptance and commitment therapy for individuals for depression, anxiety, but also a book called Act with Love of how these principles relate to intimacy and relationships. So here's some of the things that would focus on how to stop acting in ways that make your relationship worse, how to clarify and act on your values and be more like the partner you want to be, how to accept what is out of control or out of your control, and how to effectively handle the painful feelings and stresses that are just part of a relationship. So if you think about that first question, or when we get caught up in our thoughts and feelings, we often react, and this reaction to each other often creates more disconnection. Again, we get what we don't want instead of what we do want. The second one, in terms of our values, when we get caught up in our thoughts and feelings, then that often we lose sight of what we want. We lose sight of the values, the things that matter to us. And so oftentimes the negativity and the hurt drives the relationship rather than our desire for connection and understanding and so forth. The third one, again, when we try to control things we can't control, that's a natural part of just creating anxiety. When we take ownership of our own thoughts and feelings and what we can control, then that gives us the ability to be centered, to be grounded, so that we can enter into the relationship using our values and not just reacting out of our thoughts and feelings. And the last one is just basically this principle that, life is painful. And oftentimes when we look at life or relationships, we expect things that, things should be, if we're in love, then things should always be easy and things like that. But the reality is relationships are built on hard work. They are based on working through conflict. And so when we can acknowledge and work through painful feelings and thoughts without getting caught up in them, then this helps us stay present enough to be able to work through challenges in our relationship. So if you can go to the next slide. So this is where I have found using mindfulness-based therapy as kind of a foundation for emotional focus therapy has been very, very helpful. Because again, this ability to find synchrony is really based on the skills for how I show up in the relationship with being present and be able to be open to myself and to the relationship, but also how we respond with empathy and compassion to our partner. So again, because marriages and relationships in general are highly emotional, they have passion, they have intimacy, we care about the person, we care about the relationship, we have a history together. So inevitably, when there are differences or we don't feel connected, that's going to bring out emotions that often can be powerful. And those powerful emotions, if we can't communicate them or talk about them or be able to make sense of them, sometimes they come out in ways that, again, push our partner away. When we feel misunderstood or rejected, again, we can feel out of balance. We can feel disconnected. And it may be hard in an emotional state to hear, to listen, to understand because of the stuff that's going through our head and also the things that we're feeling. So for example, in terms of finding balance, there's an analogy within acceptance and commitment therapy, and it talks about this example of being a ship on the ocean. And if you're the ship on the ocean, obviously at different times, the sea can be calm, things can be going well, the sun's out, it's a beautiful day, we're enjoying the ocean with those that we love. But then sometimes the storms of life come up and we're in this ship and the ship is being tossed to and fro, back and forth. And when we get caught up in the thoughts and feelings of life, it can feel like being on the ship where life is happening to us and we're reacting to life, we're reacting to our relationships, rather than us choosing to live our lives in the way that we want to live and choosing our values. And so again, as this storm happens and as we get tossed to and fro in this ocean, we can let the oceans basically control us, or we can drop anchor. We can put the anchor down. It doesn't take the storm away. The storm is still there. But when we're anchored, we can be in the storm, but be safe in the storm. We can get through the storm and be able to get through the challenges that we have. And so that's kind of the example of the skills that we can learn in acceptance and commitment therapy is when the challenges of our relationship show up, can we find our balance? Can we be grounded and centered to be able to be open to our partner and work through and understand their point of view and be able to be aware of our own thoughts and feelings and communicate those ways or those thoughts and feelings in ways that create safety in the relationship. So if you can go to the next slide. So again, mindfulness-based therapy is oftentimes with mindfulness and meditation. It's not about getting rid of problems. It's not controlling problems. It's just making space for our problems. And so there's kind of an interesting concept that sometimes when we have challenges, and I see this a lot in the therapy I do with individuals for a variety of challenges, that when we have a challenge, often what happens with the problems that show up in our life is often our life becomes more about the problem. So I have this problem in my relationship, and so I don't want this problem in my relationship. I want to get rid of this problem in my relationship. So I spend more and more time focused on this problem in my relationship. And the more time I spend focused on this problem in the relationship, the more anxiety gets created around that problem, the more stuck I feel because this problem's still there and I want to get rid of it. So I try to push the problem away. I fight more about it. I get frustrated about it. And it just seems like the more I try to get rid of this problem in my life, the more it shows up. And so the idea of mindfulness is acknowledging that life is painful, life is difficult. We all have challenges and problems. They're all normal part of life and relationships. So how do we create space for those problems without letting our life be about those problems? So in essence, one of the kind of mantras within acceptance and commitment therapy is get out of your head and live your life. In essence, you can still live your life in a meaningful way, even though you have challenges and problems. And so that's one of the powerful things about acceptance and commitment therapy is this idea of focusing on our values, focusing on the way we want to live, acting in ways that create the life we want to live, even though we still have these differences and challenges within a relationship. So one of the common metaphors, acceptance and commitment therapy often uses metaphors to teach principles, but one really common one is the tug of war with a monster. And you can kind of see with this graphic that imagine that your challenges are this monster on the other side of this ravine. And as you try to overcome those problems, you pull and you pull and you pull, trying to get rid of those problems. And yet the more you pull to get rid of those problems, it seems like those problems pull and pull and pull, and you get caught up in them. And yet you don't want those challenges and problems in your life. So you pull harder and harder and harder because you want to get rid of them. And the more you pull, the more you struggle with those problems. It seems like the more those problems show up. And so the question is, well, how do you get rid of or how do you defeat the monster? And again, you could talk about that for a while, talk about different ways that you could defeat the monster, which sometimes creates this sense of creative hopelessness. And then again, then we feel more stuck. So it kind of teaches that principle. But the basic idea is that we drop the rope, that we stop our struggle with our problems. And again, turn away from our problems and turn to focus on the ways we can act to live the life that we want to live. So if you could go to the next slide. So one reason that we get stuck around these challenges is in our world, we kind of have this control agenda, this idea that a good life shouldn't be painful, a good life shouldn't be difficult, a happy life should just have things always work out for us. But the reality is life is difficult, life is painful, that life is made up of challenges and it is not orderly or tidy. And so if we think that's kind of the life we should have, then we try to control thoughts and feelings. And as we start to control our thoughts and feelings, again, our life just becomes about controlling our thoughts and feelings. And so one of the principles within acceptance and commitment therapy is this idea, instead of putting all our energy trying to manage these thoughts and feelings, is how do we just make space for them? How do we allow them to be? How do we respond to thoughts and feelings with flexibility, with openness, with compassion, with awareness? And as we allow thoughts and feelings to be as they are in the moment without judging them, trying to control them, that allows us to just let feelings be as they are, to let thoughts be as they are, so we can get focused back on living the life that we want to be living. So if you can move to the next slide. So again, this idea of controlling our environment, controlling our world, and particularly these ideas that we create that life should be a certain way. And because we create these beliefs, and in this case, myths about how life should be, that this creates unmet expectations. And when we have unmet expectations, that often creates feelings around those unmet expectations of maybe my partner doesn't love me, or I thought relationship would be different, or why aren't things the way that I want them to be? Now, those are all perfectly fine thoughts to have. But again, the challenge is when we create these unmet expectations and our relationship becomes about them. So for example, if you look at this first myth, the perfect partner myth, and that's pretty common, this idea that we all want to marry the prince or the princess, and therefore we want to live happily ever after. And the reality, our partner isn't perfect. We all have our flaws. And so there was a old story that a therapist wrote about this idea that even Cinderella struggled, that she married the princess and she had this life, and yet when she married this prince, she found that he didn't pick his clothes up off the floor, that he spent too much time with his friends, at least according to her, and that she was constantly criticized by her mother-in-law. And so that's kind of the reality of relationships, as opposed to this happily ever after type of myth or belief. But because we come with these expectations, again, sometimes that does create disappointment, and we can get caught up in the thoughts and stories around what those expectations might be. The other myth is you complete me. And this idea that if my partner really loved me, they should know, what I need, or what, the way that they can take care of me, as opposed to I don't need to communicate that. I don't need to be part of that. They should just know. And so this idea that somehow this partner is going to meet all my needs is also, again, just impossible. That, part of a relationship is meeting some needs, but also those needs need to be met by us or others. And we also need to communicate those. John Bradshaw kind of shared this idea. I mean, this neediness kind of talks to the ideas of enmeshment and codependency. But he kind of explained this concept and the idea of, a relationship that's based on neediness is two people playing the same tune and the same instrument. And it's this idea of codependency, that I need you to think the way I do for me to feel good about myself, or I need you to make me feel good about me, as opposed to the analogy of a kind of two whole people who choose to connect, who play different instruments, but the same tune, that I'm my own self, but I choose to love you and connect through this shared way of being together. The other myth is the idea that love should be easy, that again, it should just be, if we're in love, then everything should just work out. And again, relationships, because we have different histories, different, we grew up with different ways to express emotion, to work through conflict and so forth, is part of marriage, is over time working out the way that we do things in our own relationships. And the last myth is, again, this idea of just if you fall in love, then that should be enough, as opposed to love is something that we have to do and show up with every day. One of the challenges with, again, these myths is these myths can become filters. So if you think about all of these different myths, they become filters. So if my hand represents a filter, if I view my partner through this myth or this filter, and you can think of other filters that are not here, just your own expectations. So if I'm viewing my partner through this unmet expectation, then how am I viewing them? Am I viewing them as they are, or am I viewing them through this expectation or this filter? And so part of mindfulness is learning to put down the filters and to see ourselves as we are, to see our thoughts and feelings as they are, and to see our partner as they are. And then starting from that place, to create safety and vulnerability, so then we can work from that point to build the relationship that we want. If we let these filters or these beliefs get in the way, then again, we're often just reacting to those thoughts and feelings. So, and one of the things, again, with thoughts, I'll talk about this a little bit later, but in terms of it makes sense with the slide as well. If you think about thoughts as filters, one thought becomes 10 thoughts, becomes 50 thoughts. So think about this concept we're going to talk about later with rumination. If I have one thought about an unmet expectation with my partner, and I just keep thinking about that unmet expectation, I can create a really big story around that. So that one thought is 50 thoughts, is 100 thoughts, it's 500 thoughts, and I can just grind and grind and grind on that thought. And yet the more I grind on that thought or that unmet expectation, it doesn't make me closer to my partner. Again, it creates more disconnection, more anxiety, more frustration and anger, and again, moves me away from my values about what do I really want to do in this relationship? How do I want to show up? What kind of partner do I want to be? So anyway, move to the next slide. So within acceptance and commitment therapy, here are the basic principles. There's kind of three primary principles, and then if you break down these three primary principles, you see actually 6 different concepts. So one of the main principles is learning to be present. How do we show up in the current moment? How do we not let our thoughts and feelings kind of take over our way of connecting? How do we just maybe, instead of being caught up in them, what if I just put them over here, put them down here? I know that I'm having these thoughts and feelings, but I'm not caught up in those thoughts and feelings. So it allows me to be present in this relationship and not kind of caught up in these filters that disconnect me from this moment. Acceptance is part of that, being present, as well as part of being opening up. So opening up is allowing things to be as they are. And part of an open up is just not only the acceptance piece, but diffusion is this idea of, if we get caught up in thoughts, then oftentimes we think the thought is reality. So one of the questions in acceptance and commitment therapy is, are you your thoughts? Are your thoughts who you are? Now, sometimes our thoughts can define our actions and values, but sometimes thoughts have, they're can be about the emotions we feel, can be about maybe something we saw on TV. Thoughts can be connected to lots of different things. But if we connect with those thoughts, I'm this kind of person, or my partner's this kind of person, then again, that filter becomes the way we interact with one another. So diffusion is being able to disconnect from those thoughts, to put them kind of on the shelf, or put them in a space where we acknowledge we're having those thoughts, but we're not letting them become the way that we're viewing things. Then that's this idea of diffusion. And then the last principle is do what matters. And do what matters is know what your values are and then take action on those values. And again, as we do so, that allows us to be able to live the life that we want. All of these principles together represent what's called psychological flexibility. How do we flexibly show up for ourselves, for others, and live the life that we want to be living? The next slide. So again, as I said earlier, mindfulness is not about getting rid of thoughts and feelings. It's about just making space for those thoughts and feelings. So again, what are we bringing from our personal life that shows up in our relationships? How do our filters, our thoughts and feelings get in the way of our connection? So there's an old kind of analogy I heard a long time ago in systems theory, of this idea of, the father has a hard day at work. He's frustrated, things didn't go his way. So he brings that frustration home. So he kind of yells at his wife. He's a little short with her, why isn't dinner ready? And, now the wife's frustrated. She feels hurt. And so then she's short with the kids. Why are the kids being so loud and noisy? And then the kid goes and kicks the dog. And this idea of how we take emotion and we start displacing it and pushing it around and putting it on others, as opposed to just owning our thoughts and feelings, to be able to acknowledge our thoughts and feelings and make space for them. So even though, this father might have had a bad day, that he can come home with that bad day, make space that it was a hard day, maybe even have that conversation with his spouse, rather than being so caught up in it or pushing those thoughts and feelings in a way and not being aware of them, that then those emotions start showing up in hurtful ways in the relationship. So again, the question, do thoughts and emotions, push you around? And I mentioned that before, this idea of rumination, of how our thoughts can just be this, it's like digging a hole. If you think about, I have this problem I want to solve, or have this disappointment in this relationship. So if I keep thinking about it, then maybe I'm going to find the answer. And so I take a shovel and I have this thought and I think, I'm just going to keep thinking about it, and I'm going to keep ruminating about it, and I'm going to focus on this disappointment. And so every time I think about it, that's a shovel of dirt. And I just keep on it and I keep ruminating and ruminating. And before long, I'm in this big hole. And it's like, how did I get in this hole? Well, it's because we stay stuck in that negativity. And there's so much research that talks about how negativity creates more negativity. Negativity becomes, again, the filters that we view the world. And so learning mindfulness skills, it allows us to have frustration and anger and hurt and those types of emotions without getting caught up in those types of feelings and thoughts around those feelings, so that we can still live our life despite the fact that we have pain, we have hurt, and we have difficulty. The last kind of concept related to, again, making space is, what are the judgments we have towards ourselves? It's interesting that we often are more compassionate towards others, not always. Again, that's kind of the unique thing about marriage, is oftentimes we can be compassionate about others outside our relationship or outside our family, and yet towards ourselves and sometimes our partner, we can be harsh in terms of our own self-judgments, or sometimes our judgments about our expectations towards our partner. So again, when we have those judgments, can we just recognize those judgments and can we make space for them? Because underneath those judgments are obviously important things. They might be unmet expectations and needs that we need to talk about, we need to work through. So it's not saying get rid of thoughts and feelings. It's just learning how to look at them with more compassion, more understanding, and with less judgment. So again, does your mind sometimes judge and create judgments like, I'm not good enough? My mind tells me that I am, fill in the blank, that I'm too much of whatever that might be, that I'm not enough of. And again, all of us can probably find ways to fill in the blanks around those types of questions. Does my mind tell me that I do too much of the following? Does my mind tell me that I don't do enough of the following? I'm not measuring up to whatever list. Does my mind tell me that I lack the following? So again, if we get caught up in all those judgments about ourselves, are we able to connect with our partner if in our head we have all these thoughts about how we're not good enough? And in the same way, if we have those thoughts towards our partner about these disappointments and hurts, in the same way, it's hard to connect at an emotional level. There's this story that I heard last year, and I think kind of helps us understand this idea of how powerful both the internal voices we have about ourselves and sometimes the external voices that sometimes we hold on to with maybe judgments from others, and how both of those internal and external judgments or filters become a way that disconnects us from our values and the life we want to live. So there was once this bunch of frogs who arranged a climbing competition, and the goal was to reach the top of this very high tower. And a big crowd had gathered around the tower to see the race and cheer the contestants. And the race began, and no one in the crowd really believed that these tiny frogs would ever reach the top of this tower. And heard throughout the race were statements such as, "Oh, this is way too difficult. No one's ever going to make it there. There's no chance that you're going to succeed. The tower is too high." The tiny frogs began collapsing one by one, except for those who, in a fresh tempo, were climbing higher and higher. The crowd continued to yell, "It is too difficult. No one will make it." More tiny frogs got tired and gave up. But one continued to climb higher and higher. This one refused to give up. At the end of the race, all had given up climbing the tower except this one tiny frog. After a big effort, he was the only one that reached the top. All of the other tiny frogs wanted to know how this frog managed to do it. They asked him how he had found the strength to succeed and reach the goal. It turned out the winning frog was deaf. And I just think that's a powerful example of how sometimes we let our internal thoughts, feelings, fears get in the way of the life that we want to live, as opposed to, again, with mindfulness, opening up to, on the one, being deaf to the external voices, that not getting caught up in them, but also not getting caught up in a way, being deaf to our own inner voice that sometimes brings us down or creates these filters for how we see ourselves and others. So next slide. So here are some skills to kind of help you make space for thoughts and feelings that might be difficult, that might show up. So again, there's a difference between feeling emotion and becoming that emotion. And part of that, you've probably heard this before, name the emotion to tame the emotion. So the more that we can label emotions, we can talk about how we're feeling. In essence, it's like self-validation. If you think about in an intimate relationship, when we don't feel validated or heard, we tend to escalate. We'll say something a different way. If I just say it this way, then they'll understand. And if I say it a different way and my partner doesn't understand or our partner doesn't understand, then maybe if I say it louder, they'll understand. And if I say it louder and they don't understand, then again, we'll even, be louder, escalate more. So it's very easy as we don't feel validated to start escalating, getting this push and pull in the relationship, pursuing or withdrawing from the relationship. But if we can just notice how we feel, we can label the emotion. So I'm feeling sad or frustration, I'm hurt, or whatever that might be. I can feel the emotion and validate that for myself without getting caught up in it. So there's a difference between being frustrated, feeling frustrated, and being anger. And we all know what the difference of those two things are, of feeling something and just letting that frustration be, as opposed to becoming anger and then acting, as anger in terms of what we might say or do. So part of mindfulness, again, is opening up that awareness that I can feel what I feel, I can validate what I feel without getting caught up in those emotions and acting based on that emotion. So again, I'm not reactive. So one of the important things about, again, validating the emotion and feeling the emotion is there's not good or bad emotions. We kind of in society have like, well, these are the good emotions. You can be happy, if you can feel joy, but you shouldn't be sad. It's not okay to feel hurt. It's not okay to feel anger. So oftentimes with ourselves or oftentimes with others, sometimes we push emotions away. We don't allow people to be sad. There's a great video. I forgot to put it in the resource list that you get at the end, but it's called Emotion Coaching through Gottman. And anyways, it's just a great video that helps us as parents coach our children through their emotions and help them learn how to feel emotions, to label emotions, to notice emotions without getting caught up in those emotions. So another skill I kind of mentioned is this idea of noticing, that we notice thoughts and feelings. And that as we notice them, we kind of notice them, move them from here to just let them be over here. And just that sense of noticing, like if I'm caught up in that emotion, I'm not noticing or labeling it, then that's where the emotion is. I'm in my head. But if I can notice it, it's like, oh, I'm noticing I'm frustrated. So that noticing is one step removed from that feeling. One of the metaphors that acceptance and commitment therapy uses is this idea of leaves on a stream. And it kind of represents this idea of how we create separation from thoughts and feelings, and this idea that we are not our thoughts. So imagine that you're up in the mountains and it's a beautiful fall, and you're by a river, and as you're by this river, you just notice leaves are falling and landing in the stream and kind of moving past you. So here's a nice green leaf floating by, here's a yellow leaf floating by, here's a red leaf floating by. And oftentimes in our own thoughts, when they're, quote, positive, we let them come and go. But we have this thing called negativity bias, that when we have a negative thought, we often hold on to that thought. We ruminate about it. We like, what's that about? We feel bad about it. As opposed to like, oh, that's just a thought. And so the idea is, as you see the red leaves and the yellow leaves and the green leaves go by, they come and go. And part of the noticing is that I'm just noticing this green leaf. I'm noticing this red leaf. I'm noticing this yellow leaf. But now here comes this brown leaf. It's decayed. It's really old. It maybe has some insects on it. Oftentimes that leaf, in this case, the thought is the one we hold up and we don't let go of. But the reality is that brown decaying leaf is just another leaf. It's just another leaf floating by in the stream. And so some of the skills of mindfulness as we notice thoughts is let them be like leaves on the stream. Notice that I'm having this thought about myself or my partner. I'm going to notice it. I'm going to acknowledge it, but I'm going to let it float on by. So I'm making space for that without getting caught up in it. So the power of mindfulness is It allows us, again, to be aware of thoughts and feelings, not getting caught up in them. And by doing so, as we get grounded in how we feel, validating that, it allows us to still be present with what we want and not letting these reaction happen according to our thoughts and feelings. And again, last principle for making space and feelings, our thoughts and feelings, is acceptance. As we accept things as they are, we accept ourselves as we are, we accept our partner as they are, that opens up this space where we can be more compassionate towards ourselves and more compassionate to others. And again, in the resources that you'll receive at the end, kind of in the chat, are a video that looks at how we can become more self-compassionate and kind of this tendency for negativity. Right? All right, next slide. So another simple ways to get present, to get back in the moment, is when we get caught up in our head, again, one thought becomes 10 thoughts, becomes 50 thoughts, becomes 100 thoughts. We get so wrapped up in that creates worry, anxiety, fear, and so forth. So how do we bring ourselves back to the moment, back to being present? So these are 3 simple ways to do that. One is we focus on our breath. And breath is very powerful for 2 reasons. One, it brings our attention to our breath. So in and out, I can recognize breath. So my focus is now on my breath and not on the stories in my head. But 2, the breath also connects us, or helps connect to the parasympathetic nervous system, which is this rest and digest, the calming part of our nervous system, where the sympathetic is this, fight, flight, freeze response. And when we get anxious and worried or have conflict, again, that sympathetic nervous system takes over. So how do we regulate and get back down, but also get present in the moment? So taking 10 breaths is a very simple way to get our attention focused on our breath, to get focused back in the room, to this space, and not in, the stuff that's going in our head. And also the added benefit is it helps activate this parasympathetic nervous system. So we're going to do that just very quickly, is we're going to do them for sake of time. We're only going to do 5 breaths. But we're going to focus on breathing slowly in and out. And just notice, how your body and your thoughts and your feelings change by just slowing down, by taking these slow, deep breaths and just focusing your attention on your breath. So this is called a Hoberman sphere. And basically, as I pull it in and out, I want you just to kind of mirror this with your own breath. So starting now, breathe in and out. So taking time for just breaths, so it could be 10 breaths. If you're still feeling anxious, worried or whatever, you can just keep doing 10 breaths over and over. We'll talk a little bit about that later with meditation. But breathing is a great way to get present and also get centered in a way that we can resume just living our life, or again, resume a conversation. And in conflict conversation, it's very helpful that if things are starting to get off, we're out of synchrony, we're out of balance, things are escalating to a certain point, that it's perfectly fine to take a time out. Because what often happens is we want this relationship to work. We want to work through this problem. And so as we're in a problem, we keep pursuing, we keep kind of talking about it. But sometimes then that leads to escalation. And we know from the research, as we have conflict, the heart rate increases, blood pressure increases. And typically when we get over about 100 beats per minute, again, that sympathetic nervous system kicks in. And it's really hard for us to be present and be aware of how we're feeling. It's really hard to be empathetic and understanding to our partner because we're now emotionally escalating and getting into that fight, flee, freeze response. So again, taking a time out in a conversation, if it seems to be not going anywhere, is perfectly fine. What's really important, though, is to schedule time to then have this conversation. Because again, we talked about this pursue, withdraw. If someone's pursuing because they want to solve this problem and the person withdraws because they feel overwhelmed, because what happens is as I pursue intimacy or connection, what happens sometimes is I'm pursuing connection out of my frustration and hurt. And so I'm not doing it in a way that shows vulnerability. I'm doing it out of my frustration and anger. And so our partner may hear that frustration and anger of like, oh my, what have I done? And they become flooded and overwhelmed, and their sympathetic nervous system kicks in. And so their way of managing that emotion is to pull away. As they pull away, though, the person who's pursuing is like, oh no, here we go again. They don't want to listen to me. They don't want to hear me. They don't think this is a problem we need to talk about. And that's not necessarily the case. What this person pulling away is like, I just feel overwhelmed. I need safety. So often what will happen is the person pursuing will pursue more. They'll escalate more volume, more explanation, more attacking, criticizing. And so the other partner will pull away because feeling overwhelmed, stressed, and anxious. So again, taking a time out is perfectly fine and actually, important, because it slows down heart rate, blood pressure. It allows the parasympathetic system to kick in. But when taking a time out, it's very important that you schedule a time to resume the conversation, because the person pursuing is often thinking like, oh no, we're never going to solve this problem, which creates a lot of anxiety in them, and therefore they tend to pursue even more. The next one is dropping anchor, which is basically just physically noticing our body. So I'm pushing my feet into the floor. I'm noticing my feet grounded into the floor. I'm noticing, what my ankles are, their connection to the earth, and my calves and my knees. And I basically just kind of probably something you've done similarly in terms of a body scan. But I'm saying basically is dropping anchor into connecting to this physical space I'm in right now. As I anchor into this physical space, it gets me present into this room. And again, not in the stories or the filters that I'm creating by the thoughts they have. And the last simple one is noticing 5 things. And noticing 5 things can just be one thing. I'm noticing a painting and some chairs and so forth. I'm just noticing things around me, and that may be enough to get present back into space. But it could also be noticing 5 things, relative to your senses. What can I see? What can I hear? What can I taste, touch, and so forth? So those are different ways to get present and back into this moment, back into the relationship, back in the conversation, or back into whatever you're doing. One of the basic principles of mindfulness is whatever you do, do it. And so that bringing your attention to the present moment is very important. So next slide. All right, so I'm going to go fairly quickly through a lot of these for time. But again, acceptance is this idea I talked about before, is how do we open ourselves up to thoughts and feelings, make space for them, be flexible, seeing ourselves as a whole person, seeing our partners as whole people, as opposed to seeing ourselves through our judgments, or seeing our partner through unmet expectation. So again, as this graphic says, you can't get rid of your fears, but you can learn to live with them. And again, that same idea that, life is hard and difficult. We're always going to have challenges, but how do we make space for our problems? How do we make space for the problems in our relationship? And how do we make space for all right, next slide. So the last principle within ACT is this idea of how do we focus on values that drive what we want in a relationship, and how do we live by those values? So as Thich Nhat Hanh said, my actions are my only true belongings, that our actions kind of define the life we live, the life we create. So one of the principles of acceptance and commitment therapy, again, is stop trying to control how we feel and how to control our thoughts or getting rid of thoughts, but just focus on what we can do. And again, as we learn to be centered, as we learn to make space for thoughts and feelings, that allows us to live by our values. So a couple of questions as we conclude. Are you living your life, or is life living you? Learn to focus. And that's something I would suggest, is take some time to think about your values. Like, what are the things that you want in your personal life, health, career, et cetera, et cetera. And what are the things that you want in your intimacy, in your connection with your partner, as well as your extended relationships and other family relationships? Some other questions to think about. How do you show up for yourself and others? What do you stand for? What really matters to you? What are you about? What matters deep in your heart? Slide. So sometimes there's a gap between how we would like to behave and then the way that we actually are behaving. So again, acceptance and commitment therapy is basically being aware of that. So again, the more we're aware of thoughts and feelings, the more we're aware without getting caught up in them, that allows us then to spend time being more aware of what matters to us and spending time then acting on those values. So what is stopping you from living by your values right now? What are the barriers to that? And it's interesting oftentimes that with the couple therapy I do, that sometimes couples would rather stay in the hurt and anger and kind of because that anger feeds itself and that negativity feeds itself, rather than, understanding that, yeah, you validate the hurt, but allow your values to get over that hurt, be able to let go of that hurt and take action. So next slide. Couple concluding thoughts. There are some antidotes to either withdrawing or draining our love, or again, driving love away by letting our anger, push our partner away. So one of the ways that we feel drained is this disconnection. So when we withdraw, we feel disconnected, we feel lonely. What's the antidote of that? And so part of that is learning, even though we feel hurt, how do we still respond to bids from our partner? How do we open up to our partner? How do we engage in ways by being present, even though, again, things are difficult, things are hard? Reactivity, we talked a lot about this so far, but again, learning to be aware, open, flexible, control the things that we control, and to let go of those things that we can't control. There's this idea of, what we can control. The more we become about, in essence, kind of being masters of the universe and trying to control everything, again, that's just can create more anxiety. So if we're allowed to let go of those things and just respond to things with more openness and awareness, we're going to be able then to live the life that we want to live. Avoidance, again, not trying to get rid of hard feelings and pain by using substances or distracting ourselves or just retreating to our comfort zone. But again, how do we become more open and accepting and flexible? Getting into our head, again, getting caught up in the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves and others, seeing ourselves through judgment and criticism, or seeing our partner through criticism. Again, being aware of thoughts and our feelings as filters and working to be more present. And then the last one, again, is just neglecting our values. And again, it's very easy to lose sight of our values when we get caught up in our stories or emotions, but learning to be present, to be grounded and open ourselves up can allow us then to live by those values. All right, next slide. All right, so again, here's some last questions to just consider. How will you become more present in your daily life and relationships? How will you experience life with more openness and acceptance? What are you about, and how will you take action to live your life? Again, oftentimes in therapy, people want the therapist to fix their partner, but an important question is, well, what is your part in that relationship? What kind of partner are you? Who do you want to be in this relationship? And is there a gap between who you want to be and then the way you're acting now? And then again, kind of a thought question is, if you think about your 10-year, 20-year, 30-year, 40 or 50-year anniversary, ideally, what would you want your partner to say about you at your anniversary? One other simple activity I do with couples in therapy is I ask them to tell me about their hopes and dreams for their self, for their partner, and for their extended family, children, and so forth, kind of in the immediate future, 5 years, in the near future, midterm future, 10, 15 years, and then kind of like the later parts of life. And it's very powerful that you have couples who are very, full of conflict, and they're kind of caught in that conflict. And with that conflict, it seems like we have nothing in common. Our relationships defined by these differences. But it's very powerful when you have them talk about their hopes and dreams, that oftentimes their hopes and dreams are these shared values that they have for their relationship, for the extended family, and sometimes for each other as individuals. And so that can be a very powerful way, again, to help us focus on what we want in a relationship and not what we don't want. And again, often with a problem-based focus is we focus on what we don't want and rarely look at what we want. And so, all right, final slide. One of the questions that you may have is, what is a way that you can start your own mindfulness practice? And I think after this, you have an opportunity to ask some questions, but that would be one question I think people would be asking, like, well, how do I become more mindful? Well, there's two ways, two different practices of mindfulness. One is informal mindfulness, is just really trying every day to be more present. I mentioned before, whatever you do, do it. So when you eat breakfast, or when you have a conversation, or you're doing a task at work, or you're doing your hobby, like really be present with doing that thing. I'm sure we've all had the experience of driving to work, and then we, don't even know how we got there because we're in our head, we're thinking about stuff. And oftentimes life is that way. That I know for myself, I've spent a lot of my life in my head as opposed to living my life. And being present allows us to be more likely to live the life we want to live. Again, pay attention to our senses, pay attention to our emotions and our thoughts. Just doing that on a daily basis can help us not only change our brain in terms of how we focus on those things, but also open ourselves up to more of the life we want to live. Then there's also formal meditation. And formal meditation on the handout I'm going to give, it has some apps for that. We ran out of time for this. We're going to do a little quick meditation. Going to ring the bell. Whoops. I was going to ring the bell. And we're going to do just a quick 2-minute meditation where the bell starts you in and a couple rings take you out. But the important thing about meditation is there's not a one way or right way to meditate. You can do meditation with eyes open, eyes closed. You can do it counting your breath, looking at a space, so forth and so on. Again, the idea is making space for thoughts and feelings without getting caught up in them. And when we create a daily practice of meditation, in essence, we're practicing being able to make space for thoughts and feelings. So when we are in our relationship or when we're in our own challenges, we have space and openness to deal with them because we've been practicing by making space for thoughts and feelings through our meditation practice. So thank you very much. And probably only have a few minutes for questions, but we'll see what might show up.
Thank you so much, Shawn. That was awesome. And thank you everyone for being here. Go ahead and put your questions in that Q&A function down here. We'll just do a couple because we're close on time. But we do have one already that says, how do I determine my value system?
That's a really good question. And sometimes that is hard to kind of clarify what matters to you. But I think sometimes it's important, one, just, what are the things that you're passionate about? What are your hobbies and interests? Sometimes those can show you what your values might be about. Can also be about where you have energy, like in your relationship, like I said, with emotions can tell us what we need. So if we have certain things that keep showing up with emotions, sometimes underneath those emotions or thoughts are our values. For example, it might be spending time together. Like I feel disconnected. I feel like, we don't make time for each other. So a value would be like, I value quality time. So again, I think part of it is really goes back to mindfulness, is just making space for quiet and stillness, and being aware of thoughts and feelings, because underneath those thoughts and feelings can be the values that we want in our life, as well as particularly when we have passion, it helps drive I care about this. And if we care about something, that is also underneath that is our values.
That's perfect. Thank you. The next one that we have is, what if you don't have time to make space for your feelings or thoughts in the moment? For example, I once found that my father had been in a car crash right before I was about to teach a class. How should I practice mindfulness when I feel like I don't have the space for it?
That's a great example, because I'm assuming kind of in that moment, you're in a freeze response, you're in shock, you're kind of just, wow, I'm not sure how to act in this moment. And I think the easiest way in that moment is just to acknowledge how you're feeling, just to kind of bring it to the surface that, what, I'm in the shock, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I don't know what to do. And just kind of in essence, validating yourself can create space to be present with those thoughts and feelings, as opposed to, I got to teach this class, I'm going to push them away. And as I try to push them away, well, obviously it's hard to push away. This is a pretty traumatic issue. So instead, why not just bring those feelings and fears to the surface and validate them? And again, you'd have to use your own boundaries and thoughts, but you could even bring that to the class. Like, what, I'm having a hard time concentrating because this just happened, and let that be present in that moment, depending on your own safety and boundaries. But sometimes that can be a way also to, let it be what it is in the moment, as opposed to pushing away. But again, that's a difficult situation. That's hard.
Yeah, really hard. Thank you for sharing. We have just one last question, and then we'll close out the webinar today. Can you apply this to how to work with pet peeves within a marriage and having a more positive view of your partner?
Yeah, definitely. Because I think the pet peeves become the rumination, like, oh, this thing they do and they always do it. And again, that's that's where acceptance comes into play. Like Gottman talks about perpetual problems and solvable problems. And, that's one of the things you'd have to look at, and maybe look at some Gottman stuff. Like, is this a solvable pet peeve? And a solvable pet peeve is, who takes the trash out, or, who's responsible for what? Whereas a perpetual problem is more about your values. What are your values for spending money? What do you care about in regard to money? And sometimes we fight about, like with money, you should spend, or I need to spend, or you can't spend. And it's yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And that conflict is actually the values underneath that. What does money mean to us? And so I would say, when you look at those pet peeves, is the pet peeve a value? Because if it's a value difference, well, you just have to accept it. It's just that you're just different. If it's a solvable problem about how things are done, then that becomes more where, how do you look at that with acceptance and openness, but also with your own sense of, what that means to you, and create safety around that conversation.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, as I say, it looks like the handout's there. And if you don't have time to get it, you can always email me and I can send it that way as well.
Yeah, so just go ahead and click on that link really quick. Thank you so much, Shawn, and thank you everyone else for joining us tonight. We're so grateful for your participation. Once again, if you attended this webinar for that CEU credit today, make sure to stay on till the end of the webinar, and then you'll receive that survey. It will automatically load onto your screen. If for some reason it doesn't show up, please email marriagecommission@usu.edu for your certification, and we'll make sure you guys get it. Thanks so much, guys. Have a great rest of your night.
Thank you.